recently participating in an online forum in conjunction with an interview that I had given as part of a podcast. And on this forum, I was asked if I could comment specifically on a YouTube video that was purporting to interpret the book of the Revelation of St. John, or the Apocalypse of John, which is in the canonical so-called New Testament. And I don't normally comment or get into critiques of the works or videos of other people, but in this circumstance, the person was asking me about this specific video, and so I gave some comments as to what I believe the interpretation of that particular passage in the book of Revelation was talking about, as opposed to the very literalistic interpretation that was being given in this YouTube video. In fact, this YouTube video was suggesting it was from a literalistic perspective, and it was suggesting a specific date in September of 2017, September of this year, as a date for the beginning of a literal pre-tribulation rapture. So I felt that it was appropriate to give my explanation of what I think that passage in Revelation is really talking about. So because I went ahead and gave that explanation there, I'm going to share what I showed there with the rest of my listeners or readers on my blog in this video, and try and explain why I do not believe that that interpretation that's offered in that specific video that's calling or pointing to or suggesting the specific date is correct. In fact, I think it's very misleading and misguided interpretation of that specific biblical scripture.
I am going to blow your mind.
So this is the video that I was asked to comment on. I disagree with the interpretations offered in this particular video. It interprets the events described in Revelation 12 as a literal rapture based on a mixture of literalistic interpretation plus some limited understanding of celestial metaphors thrown in. The understanding that the events in the Bible are based on celestial metaphor is sometimes called aztrotheology. First, I'll give a very brief summary of what that video presents in its interpretation of Revelation 12, an interpretation which I believe to be misguided and potentially dangerous, or at least potentially very misleading to those who believe this misinterpretation. This is only a brief summary of its argument. If you want to see the whole thing, go to the original video. It argues that Revelation 12 is describing a prophecy to take place in the future, in which the church, meaning those who have put their faith in a literal Jesus, is going to be snatched up or raptured. The word rapture means to snatch up, like a raptor or an eagle grabbing its prey. The video interprets the, quote, sign in the heavens or wonder in the heaven, which is described in Revelation 12, verse 1, as referring to a conjunction of the sun, moon, and some visible planets in the constellation Virgo. And I do believe that the author of this video is correct when connecting this passage to the constellation Virgo. That's correct. This Revelation passage is talking about Virgo and then the surrounding region in the sky. But citing the text where it says there's 12 stars on her head, he declares that this refers to the constellation Leo, and then says since Leo has only 9 stars, we've got to add some others to get to 12. And then based on that, he looks for a time when there's visible planets also in the area above the head of Virgo, and when the moon is also at her feet. And so based on that, he's going to come up with a specific date in September of 2017 when 3 planets to add to the 9 stars that he counts for Leo are in the region above the head of Virgo. Specifically, he's talking about Mars, Mercury, and Venus. Plus, he points out Jupiter is in the side of Virgo. So based on this interpretation, he comes up with a date of September 23rd of this year, 2017, and suggests that that date may be the beginning of a literal tribulation along with a pre-tribulation rapture of believers who believe in a literal historical Christ. There are a lot of problems with his interpretation, the biggest being the assumption that the events and characters described in the scripture must be believed to be literal, historical, external characters in order for you to properly, quote, believe the Bible. That's a mistake. But in addition to that mistake, his celestial interpretation is incomplete and it's selective. Let's start first with the fact that Leo does not necessarily have only 9 stars. There's actually countless stars in the region of Leo or any other constellation, as you can see for yourself if you go out to a very dark place and look at the night sky on a clear night. How you connect the stars and how many stars you choose is open to interpretation, even for the famous constellations. To declare that there are only 9, as this video does, in Leo, is a dangerous plank upon which to build an entire argument about a specific date for the rapture of the church. The count of 9 stars actually leaves out the true outline of the lion's head and his dignified looking muzzle. And if you use the outline of Leo as suggested by H.A. Ray, the author H.A. Ray in 1952, you'll see that it looks a lot more like a lion than the outline that's being used in that video that I'm commenting upon here. And I have shown in my work that the outlines H.A. Ray suggested in 1952 actually match up very well with ancient artwork on Greek pottery, many other pieces of ancient art, as well as with actual details in the scriptures and the myths themselves. So here's the sky. Here's the head of Virgo on the left, and I'm going to number the stars of Leo in red, starting with Denebola in the tail of the lion. Denebola marks the tail. And then we go around. We'll include the front legs in this count because one of those is actually indicated by the star Regulus, the brightest star in that constellation Leo. In fact, it's one of Leo's most important stars. So that's 12 stars right there. It's a reclining lion, much like the Sphinx at Giza, with its 2 front paws visible, but the rear legs are kind of folded under it in the Giza plateau. So if we add in the rear legs, as H.A. Ray suggests, we actually get to 15 stars. If we leave them out, we get to 12, which matches up with the passage. But actually, H.A. Ray adds in this one on the back of the lion, so that makes 16. We don't know exactly how many stars the Revelation passage counts for Leo. The point is, the author of this video that I'm referring to confidently declares that it must be 9, and then he builds his whole case on that count. There could just as easily be said to be 12 stars in Leo, so you don't need any extra planets, and then his whole dating scheme for 2017 falls apart. Also, planets are not stars, and the ancients did not think that they were either. But that's not all that this video misinterprets. The author of this video does not fully understand the celestial symbolism that's at work. Let's look at the whole region of the sky there. There's Virgo, who does indeed resemble a woman in travail or in labor, about to give birth. And she shows up in that role, Virgo, in many myths around the world. Now, waiting beneath her upraised feet is the fearsome dragon with 7 heads, and that's represented by the constellation Scorpio. Scorpio often appears in different myths as having 7 heads, sometimes 8 heads, sometimes 9 heads. And that's a very common way that Scorpio appears in ancient myths, literally around the world. So you can see the dragon is waiting to devour the child that the woman brings forth. And you can see that the scorpion is in perfect position to devour the child. But, as Revelation 12 tells us, as soon as the child is brought forth, it is caught up unto God and his throne. The child that is caught up is the constellation Corona Borealis, or the Northern Crown. That may seem to be an unusual connection for the Northern Crown, but it's actually, that constellation appears as a child who is caught up in many of the world's myths, including the myth of Maui when he's a baby and his grandfather snatches him out of the ocean and hangs him up to dry in the rafters beside the fire because the Milky Way is right there. That represents the fire. The northern crown also plays the role of a baby in the story of the judgment of Solomon. That's the living baby that's being held up by the swordsman in that story, and in many other myths as well. So next we're told that the serpent persecutes the woman, but she's given wings of eagles to fly away. And later we're told that the serpent opens his mouth and casts out water as a flood to carry the woman away, and then the earth helps the woman by opening its mouth and swallowing her. These are all celestial metaphors related to that same region of the sky, just like the snatching up of the child is related to these constellations. It's not necessarily have anything to do with a rapture. Okay, the wings of the eagles refer to a constellation just above Scorpio there. Aquila, the eagle, it's right above Scorpio, so it's the wings of the eagle that rescue her. The river coming out of the dragon's mouth is this long, sinuous form of Hydra, which is actually a serpent, another serpent constellation. You can't really see it in this diagram, but I'll show it in a moment. But the very name of Hydra indicates that it can resemble flowing water, like a river. It does resemble a river in the sky. And then as the earth turns towards the east, the constellations are going to move westward into the sky. And so Virgo does seem to be carried away along with Hydra, and then the earth swallows her up when the constellation sets into the western horizon. The author of that video does not really know what to make of some of this celestial imagery. When he gets to the flood coming from the mouth of Scorpio, he says at this point, quote, "However, river or a flood is symbolism for an invasion, an attack. These are military armies. You're not going to see water coming out of a serpent's mouth," end quote. And that's true in a serpent on the earth. You don't see water coming out of a serpent on the earth, but in the sky, Hydra does go before Scorpio. And then in the next verse, where the earth swallows up the woman, he declares confidently that this means that the, quote, invasion was thwarted. Actually, he doesn't understand the full language of the celestial metaphor. Here's another view of Virgo and Leo, and this time showing them farther above the horizon so that you can see Hydra visible beneath, and you can see why the passage tells us that the dragon tried to have her carried away on the flood. This passage in Revelation 12 is describing celestial scenes and turning them into characters and events, which is exactly what we find taking place throughout all the world's myths, and including the stories in the Old and the New Testaments. All the ancient myths and sacred stories of the world do this, and I'm convinced that they do this as a means of esoterically conveying profound truths. But they're not describing literal history, nor are they describing literal future history or future events. When we don't understand the language that they're speaking, we're very likely to misinterpret their message. And that's what I believe that the video in question about Revelation 12 and a literal rapture has done. It's misinterpreted an esoteric text as if it were describing literal history, or in this case, literal future history, events in the future that will take place in literal terrestrial history on the ground here on Earth. If the author of that video understood this celestial language a little bit more, he would discover that all the stories in the scriptures of the Bible are based upon this very same system of celestial metaphor, just like all the other myths of the world. And this fact actually unites all the world's ancient wisdom. They're all part of the same family, closely related and using the same celestial system. These texts convey a profound and beautiful and uplifting message, but trying to force them into a literalistic interpretation can cause us to miss their message and indeed to turn it completely upside down, which is what I believe in this video describing a literal rapture in September 2017 is doing.